September 1990. Whitney Houston was at the absolute peak of her career. 2 Diamond certified albums. 7 consecutive #1 singles. The voice that had redefined popular music. But on this particular evening, behind the locked doors of one of Manhattan's most legendary recording studios, the woman with the golden voice was sobbing uncontrollably. The man who had discovered her, who had shaped her into a superstar, who claimed to have her best interests at heart, had just said something so devastating that it would change the trajectory of Whitney's entire career. Clive Davis, the legendary music executive with an ear for hits and a reputation for being ruthlessly right, had pushed Whitney too far. What started as a creative discussion about her third album had escalated into a 3-hour battle that would determine whether Whitney Houston, the artist, would survive or whether she would become just another manufactured product designed to maximize profit. The decision made in that studio that night didn't just affect one album. It set in motion a pattern of artistic compromise that would haunt Whitney for the rest of her life. If you want to discover the hidden moment when Whitney lost control of her own voice and how the music industry's obsession with commercial success destroys the very artists it claims to celebrate, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will expose the brutal truth about who really controls the music you love. Let's dive into the night Clive Davis made Whitney cry and everything changed forever. To understand what happened in that studio, you need to understand where Whitney Houston came from and what music meant to her soul. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born into music royalty. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a legendary gospel singer who had performed with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick. Her godmother was Aretha Franklin herself. But more important than the famous names was the tradition they represented. Gospel music, the music of the Black church, the music of spiritual expression and emotional truth. Whitney grew up singing in the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. Every Sunday, she stood beside her mother and learned what singing really meant. It wasn't about technical perfection or commercial appeal. It was about channeling something larger than yourself. It was about touching the divine through sound. It was about truth. When Whitney sang gospel, she was home, her mother Cissy recalled years later. That's when you saw the real girl. Not the superstar, not the manufactured pop princess, but the young woman who understood that singing was a form of prayer. Whitney's voice teacher, her mother, had trained her in the old-school gospel tradition. Full-throated power, emotional vulnerability, the ability to make people feel something profound. These weren't techniques designed to sell records. They were spiritual practices passed down through generations of Black women who used their voices as instruments of survival, resistance, and transcendence. When Clive Davis discovered 19-year-old Whitney singing backup for her mother at a nightclub in 1983, he immediately recognized her extraordinary talent. But what he heard and what Whitney felt she was offering were two fundamentally different things. Clive heard a voice that could be molded into the perfect crossover artist. A Black woman with the technical skill of an opera singer, the emotional depth of a gospel singer, and the commercial appeal to dominate both Black and white markets. He heard dollar signs. Whitney thought she was being given the opportunity to share the music she loved with a larger audience. She thought she was going to bring gospel's emotional honesty to popular music. She didn't realize she was signing up to become a product. The first 2 albums had been carefully controlled by Clive. He selected every song, approved every arrangement, and made sure that Whitney's powerful gospel-trained voice was channeled into safe, broadly appealing pop ballads. Songs like Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, and Greatest Love of All were technically impressive and commercially successful, but they weren't the music Whitney wanted to make. "I wanted to do more up-tempo stuff," Whitney said in a rare, honest interview in 1989. "I wanted to do more R&B, more songs that reflected where I came from." But Clive had a vision, and his vision was making a lot of money, so I trusted him. By 1990, Whitney had become the biggest female artist in the world. She had sold over 50 million albums. She had won multiple Grammy Awards. She had broken down racial barriers on MTV. She had achieved everything Clive's vision had promised. But she had also become increasingly uncomfortable with being packaged as a crossover pop princess when her heart belonged to gospel and R&B. The third album, which would eventually be titled I'm Your Baby Tonight, was supposed to be Whitney's chance to assert some creative control. She was now established enough, successful enough, powerful enough to have say in her own music. Or so she thought. What Whitney didn't understand was that Clive Davis didn't see successful artists as people who had earned autonomy. He saw them as profitable assets that needed to be managed even more carefully. The more successful Whitney became, the more important it was to Clive that she continued to follow his formula. Because in his mind, he had created Whitney Houston, and what he created, he controlled. The recording sessions for Whitney's third album began in the summer of 1990. For the first time in her career, Whitney had specifically requested to work with producers who understood R&B and could help her create a more soulful, authentic sound. She wanted to work with L.A. Reid and Babyface, the production duo who were revolutionizing R&B music with their innovative blend of hip-hop beats and melodic sophistication. She wanted to work with Luther Vandross, her mentor and friend, who understood gospel roots. And most importantly, she wanted to include songs that reflected her own taste and musical identity, not just what Clive thought would sell to the widest possible audience. Clive had reluctantly agreed to let her work with these producers, but he maintained veto power over which songs would actually appear on the album. And from the beginning, he made it clear that he was not impressed with the direction Whitney wanted to take. The title track, I'm Your Baby Tonight, was produced by L.A. Reid and Babyface. It was funky, up-tempo, and had a distinctly black sound that was nothing like Whitney's previous ballad-heavy albums. When Whitney first played it for Clive, his response was lukewarm. It's fine, he said, but where are the big ballads? Where are the songs that will get played on adult contemporary radio? Where are the crossover hits? Whitney tried to explain her vision. She wanted this album to be more rhythmic, more connected to her R&B roots, more representative of who she actually was as an artist. She was tired of being criticized by black audiences for being too pop, too white, too manufactured. This album was supposed to prove that she hadn't forgotten where she came from. Clive's response was calculated and cutting. Whitney, I understand you want to be authentic, but authentic doesn't always sell 15 million copies. We have a formula that works. Why would we abandon it? Because I'm more than just a formula, Whitney replied, her frustration building. I'm an artist. I have something to say. You're a brand, Clive corrected her. And brands don't suddenly change their identity because they're having an identity crisis. That exchange, witnessed by several people in the studio that day, set the tone for what would become an increasingly contentious recording process. Over the next several weeks, Whitney and her chosen producers created what they felt was a strong, cohesive album that showcased her versatility and connected her to contemporary R&B. But every time they presented new material to Clive, he pushed back. Not black enough for black radio, not pop enough for pop radio. Too risky, too different. Not what Whitney Houston fans expect. The breaking point came in September during a late-night session at the power station. Whitney had just recorded a gospel-influenced ballad that she had co-written, one of the few times she had been allowed to contribute as a songwriter. The song was deeply personal, drawing on her church roots and expressing vulnerability and spiritual yearning. When she played it for Clive, she was glowing with pride. This was the music she had always wanted to make. Clive listened in silence. When the song ended, he turned to Whitney and said 5 words that shattered her. This will never see release. What happened next would become legendary among the producers and engineers who witnessed it, a cautionary tale about what happens when commercial concerns completely override artistic integrity. Clive Davis was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. Decades in the music industry had taught him that quiet authority was far more effective than loud confrontation. So when he told Whitney that her gospel ballad would never be released, he said it with calm, absolute certainty, as if it were a simple fact rather than a devastating rejection. Whitney stared at him in disbelief. What do you mean it will never see release? That's one of the most honest things I've ever recorded. Honest doesn't matter, Clive said. What matters is commercial viability. And that song, while technically well performed, is not what your audience wants to hear from you. How do you know what my audience wants? Whitney's voice was rising now, frustration breaking through her usual deference to Clive's judgment. Have you asked them? Or have you just decided for them? Clive's expression didn't change. Whitney, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've broken more artists than most people have met. I know what works and what doesn't. That song doesn't work. For who? Whitney demanded. For you? For the radio programmers? For the white audiences you're so desperate to keep appealing to? When do I get to make music for myself? That question hung in the air. The producers and engineers in the studio suddenly became very interested in their equipment, trying to make themselves invisible as the conversation escalated. You make music for yourself after you stop being commercially relevant, Clive said with brutal honesty. Right now, you make music that maintains your position at the top of the industry. That's the deal. That's what you signed up for. I signed up to sing, Whitney said, and now there were tears forming in her eyes. I didn't sign up to be a puppet. Clive stood up, preparing to leave. If you want to be a gospel singer performing in small churches for small audiences, that's your choice. But if you want to be Whitney Houston, the biggest female artist in the world, then you will record the songs I select with the producers I approve in the style that has made you successful. This conversation is over. No, Whitney said firmly. It's not over. For the next 3 hours, Whitney Houston and Clive Davis engaged in the most intense confrontation of their professional relationship. It wasn't a screaming match. It was something more devastating. A slow, methodical dismantling of Whitney's artistic confidence. Clive, with decades of experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of the music business, systematically explained to Whitney why every choice she wanted to make was wrong. The gospel song? Too niche. The R&B producers? Too trendy. The up-tempo material? Not enough ballads. Her desire for creative control? Naive and potentially career-destroying. You think you know better than me? Clive asked at one point. Let me ask you something. How many diamond albums had you sold before you met me? How many #1 singles? How many Grammy Awards? The implication was clear. Whitney's success was his creation. Without him, she was just another talented girl from Newark. I had the voice before I met you, Whitney said quietly. Yes, Clive agreed. You had a voice. I gave you a career. And if you want to keep that career, you'll trust my judgment. Whitney tried a different approach. What if we compromise? What if we include some of my songs alongside some of yours? Give the audience both. The audience doesn't want both, Clive insisted. They want consistency. They want to know what they're getting when they buy a Whitney Houston album. If we confuse them with a confused artistic identity, we lose them. So I'm not allowed to grow? Whitney asked. I'm not allowed to evolve as an artist? You're allowed to grow within the parameters of your brand, Clive said. Evolution is fine. Revolution is commercial suicide. As the hours stretched on, something began to shift in Whitney's demeanor. The fight was draining out of her. The conviction that had fueled her resistance was being worn down by Clive's relentless certainty. She was tired. She was emotionally exhausted. And she was beginning to doubt herself. Maybe Clive was right. Maybe her artistic instincts couldn't be trusted. Maybe the success she had achieved was entirely due to his vision, and without it, she would fail. At around midnight, Whitney finally broke. Fine, she said, tears streaming down her face. We'll do it your way. We'll record your songs. We'll make your album. But I want you to know that you're killing something in me. You're taking the part of me that loves music and turning it into something mechanical and dead. Clive's expression softened slightly. Whitney, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect your career. Someday you'll understand that everything I do is for your own good. But the damage was done. The gospel ballad Whitney had been so proud of was erased from the master tapes. The album that was eventually released, I'm Your Baby Tonight, was a compromise that satisfied no one. It had enough R&B production to alienate some of her pop audience, but not enough authenticity to fully win over black radio. It sold well by any normal standard, but it was considered a disappointment compared to her previous albums. More importantly, something fundamental had changed in Whitney Houston that night. She had learned that her artistic vision didn't matter, that her desires as an artist were secondary to commercial considerations, that she was not a creative partner, but a product to be managed. That lesson would have consequences that extended far beyond one album. After the battle over I'm Your Baby Tonight, Whitney Houston's relationship with Clive Davis entered a new phase. On the surface, everything looked professional and successful. Clive continued to guide her career with his trademark precision, selecting material and overseeing production. Whitney continued to deliver stunning vocal performances and maintain her position as one of the world's biggest stars. But people close to Whitney noticed changes. The joy that had once been evident when she sang began to fade. The process of recording, which had once been exciting and fulfilling, became increasingly mechanical. She would arrive at the studio, sing whatever was required of her with technical perfection, and leave without the enthusiasm that had once animated her work. It was like watching someone go through the motions, said a studio musician who worked with Whitney throughout the 90s. She would nail every take on the first or second try, but there was no spark. It felt like she was clocking in for a job rather than creating art. Whitney began to express her frustration in subtle ways. She would show up late to recording sessions. She would push back on Clive's song selections, not with the passionate conviction she had shown during the I'm Your Baby Tonight sessions, but with weary resignation. And she began to talk more openly, in private moments, about feeling trapped. "I'm in a golden cage," she told her friend and collaborator B.B. Winans during a vulnerable conversation in 1992. "Everyone sees the gold, but nobody understands that it's still a cage. I can't sing what I want. I can't work with who I want. I can't even write my own music because Clive says I'm not a songwriter." The success of the Bodyguard soundtrack in 1992 seemed to validate Clive's approach. It became the best-selling soundtrack of all time, largely on the strength of Whitney's cover of I Will Always Love You. But even that triumph came with a hidden cost. Whitney had initially resisted recording the song, feeling it was too similar to the ballads she had already been pigeonholed into performing. Clive had insisted, and when the song became a massive hit, it reinforced the dynamic. Clive was right. Whitney's instincts were wrong. Trust the man who knows best. But those close to Whitney saw the psychological toll. Every time she subordinated her artistic judgment to Clive's commercial calculations, she lost a little more of her sense of self. The artist she had wanted to become was being systematically erased, replaced by the product Clive had created. The pattern that began in that studio in 1990 continued throughout the decade. Clive selected the songs. Clive chose the producers. Clive determined the sound. Whitney provided the voice, but had increasingly less say in how that voice would be used. And with each passing year, as her personal life became more complicated with her marriage to Bobby Brown and the media scrutiny intensified, Whitney had less energy to fight the battles that had once seemed so important. By the late 90s, industry insiders began to notice a troubling correlation. As Whitney's creative autonomy decreased, her struggles with substance abuse increased. It wasn't a simple cause and effect relationship, but the connection was there. When artists lose control of their art, when they become products rather than creators, they often seek escape in other ways. I think Whitney started using because it was the only thing in her life she could control, suggested one of her former backup singers. Clive controlled her music. Bobby was controlling in their relationship. The media controlled her image. Drugs and alcohol were the only choices that felt like hers. Clive Davis has always maintained that every decision he made regarding Whitney's career was in her best interest. And by commercial standards, he was right. The albums he shepherded to completion sold millions of copies. The songs he selected became legendary hits. The career he managed reached heights that few artists ever achieve. But commercial success and artistic fulfillment are not the same thing. And the question that haunts Whitney's legacy is whether the massive commercial success was worth the cost to her artistic soul and, ultimately, to her life. Throughout the 90s, even as she was delivering platinum albums and sold-out world tours, Whitney Houston had one persistent dream. She wanted to record a gospel album. It wasn't about commercial success or career strategy. It was about returning to her roots, honoring her mother and the tradition that had shaped her, and finally making music that felt spiritually meaningful to her. She mentioned this desire in interviews, casually at first, then more insistently as the years went on. In 1996, after completing The Preacher's Wife soundtrack, which featured gospel-influenced material, Whitney approached Clive Davis with a serious proposal. She wanted her next album to be a pure gospel project. Traditional songs and contemporary gospel, featuring her mother Whitney Houston and other artists from the gospel world. Music that would connect her back to the spiritual foundation that had been lost in years of commercial pop production. Clive's response was immediate and unequivocal. "No, gospel albums don't sell," he told her. "Not in the numbers your career requires. It would be seen as a step backward, as a retreat from the mainstream success you've achieved. It would damage your brand." Whitney tried to argue that The Preacher's Wife soundtrack had sold well and featured gospel material. But Clive pointed out that it was a movie soundtrack with broad appeal, not a pure gospel project that would be marketed to a limited audience. If you want to sing gospel, do it in church, Clive said. But don't ask your record label to invest millions of dollars in a vanity project that won't recoup its costs. The dream of a gospel album became symbolic of everything Whitney had lost in her relationship with Clive. It represented artistic autonomy, spiritual authenticity, and the connection to her roots that the commercial machine had systematically stripped away. Every time she brought it up and Clive shut it down, it reinforced the fundamental power dynamic. He decided what music she would make. Her desires were irrelevant. In 2002, after completing her album Just Whitney, which had been another artistically compromised project shaped entirely by Clive's vision, Whitney made a bold decision. She left Arista Records and Clive Davis. The official press releases talked about mutual respect and the natural end of a successful partnership. But people close to the situation knew the truth. Whitney had finally reached her breaking point. She needed to escape Clive's control if she was going to have any chance of artistic fulfillment. One of the first projects Whitney pursued after leaving Arista was, finally, a gospel album. In 2003, she began preliminary work on the project she had dreamed about for over a decade. She was going to do it her way, on her own terms, without Clive Davis telling her what she could and couldn't record. But by this point, Whitney's personal struggles had intensified to the point where completing any project was difficult. The gospel album, which could have been a moment of artistic redemption and spiritual reconnection, never materialized in the way she had envisioned. Some recordings were made, but the full album was never completed or released during her lifetime. The tragedy is that Whitney spent the most commercially successful years of her career, the years when she had the power and resources to make any kind of music she wanted, being told that her artistic instincts were wrong. And by the time she finally had the freedom to follow those instincts, the damage had been done. Her confidence was shattered, her spirit was broken, and the addiction issues that had been simmering in the background had exploded into the foreground. The gospel album that never was stands as a symbol of all the music Whitney Houston never got to make. All the artistic choices she never got to explore. All the creative fulfillment she was denied in service of commercial calculations. To be fair to Clive Davis, his assessment of the commercial music landscape was largely accurate. The formula he created for Whitney Houston, the careful balance of technical virtuosity and broad appeal, did make her one of the most successful artists of all time. The songs he selected became timeless classics. The career he managed reached unprecedented heights. If success is measured purely in albums sold, awards won, and cultural impact achieved, Clive Davis made all the right decisions. But if success is measured in artistic fulfillment, creative autonomy, and the ability to express one's authentic voice, then Clive's approach was devastating. He created a superstar, but he may have destroyed an artist in the process. The music industry is filled with similar stories. Talented artists who are molded into commercial products, who achieve massive success while losing their artistic souls. It's a pattern that repeats across genres and generations. Young artists sign contracts hoping for the opportunity to share their music with the world. They don't realize they're signing away their creative autonomy, that they're agreeing to become brands rather than artists. Clive Davis was not uniquely evil in his approach to Whitney Houston. He was, in many ways, the epitome of the traditional record executive. Someone who sees artists as assets to be managed, who believes that commercial success is the only meaningful measure of value, and who is willing to override artistic instincts in service of market calculations. But the human cost of this approach is rarely acknowledged. The psychological damage of being told, repeatedly, that your creative instincts are wrong. The spiritual emptiness of making music that doesn't reflect your authentic self. The loss of purpose that comes from being reduced to a product. Whitney's story suggests that these costs are real and that they could be devastating. In the years since Whitney's death in 2012, Clive Davis has spoken extensively about their relationship. He has expressed love and admiration for her. He has celebrated her talent and mourned her loss. But he has never acknowledged that his approach to managing her career might have contributed to her struggles. He has never publicly questioned whether the commercial success was worth the artistic compromise. He has never admitted that maybe, just maybe, Whitney should have been allowed to make that gospel album. The confrontation in the Power Station studio in September 1990 was a turning point, not just in Whitney Houston's career, but in how we understand the relationship between artistic integrity and commercial success in the music industry. What happened that night? Clive Davis making Whitney cry and ultimately forcing her to abandon her artistic vision in favor of commercial calculations represents a larger pattern that continues to shape popular music today. Young artists, especially women and especially artists of color, are often placed in impossible situations. They're told they need to be authentic while simultaneously being molded into marketable products. They're celebrated for their uniqueness while being pressured to conform to proven formulas. They're promised creative control that evaporates the moment commercial considerations come into play. Whitney's story is a cautionary tale about what happens when the business of music completely overrides the art of music. Her extraordinary talent was exploited rather than nurtured. Her creative instincts were dismissed rather than developed. And her desire to make meaningful, personally authentic music was treated as a naive obstacle to profit maximization. The saddest part is that we'll never know what kind of artist Whitney Houston could have become if she had been allowed to follow her own vision. We'll never hear the gospel album she dreamed of making. We'll never experience the more R&B influenced sound she wanted to explore. We'll never know how her artistry might have evolved if she had been treated as a creative partner rather than a product to be managed. What we do know is that the pattern established that night in 1990, the subordination of artistic vision to commercial calculation, contributed to Whitney's gradual disconnection from the joy and purpose that music had once provided. And when artists lose that connection, when making music becomes a joyless obligation rather than a passionate calling, the consequences extend far beyond a recording studio. Whitney Houston's voice was one of the greatest gifts popular music has ever received. But the industry that profited from that gift failed to protect the person behind the voice. They took what they needed from her and gave back a golden cage that looked like success but felt like imprisonment. The battle in the studio wasn't just about one album or one song. It was about whether Whitney Houston would be allowed to be an artist or whether she would be forced to remain a product. Clive Davis won that battle, but everyone lost the war. This powerful story reveals the hidden cost of commercial success and the brutal reality of how the music industry treats its greatest talents. What Clive Davis did to Whitney that night wasn't unique, but it was devastating, and it set in motion patterns that would haunt her for the rest of her life. If this story changed your understanding of what really happens behind the scenes in the music industry, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to know the truth about artistic control and commercial compromise. Leave a comment about how we can better support artists who want to maintain their creative integrity. Subscribe and ring that bell because we have more stories that expose the difficult truths behind music's greatest legends. Until next time, remember that the best music comes from authentic artistic expression, not from commercial calculation, and that when we treat artists as products instead of people, we lose something irreplaceable.